Welcome to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm continuing the series on casualness and the evidential value of casualness. And what I'm considering is an alternative to truth as an explanation for apparent casualness. I want to talk about that today. Remember that we're talking about the casualness, or as the older authors called it, artlessness, with which something is mentioned in an account as an evidence of truth. The person, or so goes my argument, does not appear to have his eye fixed on his audience, his eye fixed on the impression that he is making. He's not trying. He's not trying to make some special subtle connection or to imply a symbolic meaning for what he tells. He's not trying to induce his audience to note something as a mark of truthfulness, but he just is telling what is the truth. Again, you can be strenuously insistent that you are telling the truth and be telling the truth. So that doesn't mean that if you're strenuously insisting or trying to give evidence of your own truthfulness that you're not truthful. But there is a particular type of evidence that we get from artlessness and casualness, especially when something is otherwise confirmed, that is particularly strong in its own way. And I've connected this both with undesigned coincidences between the texts of the canonical Gospels and documents within the canon, and then also connections to incidental external facts and confirmations, and how this casualness, and then you find that it is true and it's connected in some indirect way, is evidence that the person's story is true. The alternative I'm thinking of today that you will find skeptics bringing up sometimes is a airy claim that something is common knowledge. So the idea is that there's a portion of the person's story that is either true and widely known to be true, or at least was a widely accepted part of oral tradition, that the author makes something up that fits with this background fact, and doesn't emphasize or stress or explain this other thing because it was already common knowledge. So the idea is, in this alternative, the author is in fact making something up. He is in fact partially fictionalizing, and he is in fact hoping that his partial fiction will be more accepted because it connects with something else that is true, or even something else that's widely believed, but he doesn't even feel that he has to state that other thing because he just figures his audience will believe it already, or will know it already. So here would be a modern example of where this might be a consideration. Let's suppose that I am speaking somewhere and I give an anecdote about getting a traffic ticket for a moving violation, either speeding or going through a red light or something of that kind. And in my story, I say, so I looked into my rearview mirror and I saw those red flashers going in my rearview mirror, and I thought, uh-oh, and then I continue. Now, you could discover that in Michigan and in the United States at this time, the police do in fact use red flashers, and if you are being pulled over by the police, you will see those red flashers. Cars have rearview mirrors on them, and so that part of my story is true. But if I'm telling it to a contemporary American audience, for which this has just been a fact of life for decades, okay, that's not really going to confirm the truth of my story overall very much, because I can just assume that my audience is going to know what I'm talking about when I say I looked up and I saw those flashers going round and round, red flashers in my mirror, and I thought, uh-oh, they're going to immediately be with me on that. So because I can assume that to be common knowledge, the fact that it is in fact true isn't necessarily something that confirms my story very much due to my casualness. And due to the fact that I don't bother to explain that, well, of course I don't bother to explain that. Everybody in my audience is already going to know that. It might be relevant if someone skeptical of my story were claiming that I had given that talk, much later, and you could go and find out that at that time, there were no more police red flashers or something like that. You could use that to argue for an earlier origin, an earlier publication, as it were, of that talk, and against that type of skeptical scenario. But if everybody realizes that I'm delivering this to a contemporary American audience, then confirming red flashers doesn't do much to confirm my story. That's an example of the use of common knowledge to explain casualness as an alternative to truthfulness. Now, my story might, of course, still be true, but it just means that my casualness in mentioning the red flashers, my assumption that my audience will understand, is the reason why I don't explain it. Okay, now let's go on to a gospel example. For this presentation, I am going to make a repeated reference to a private dialogue that I had some years back with an interlocutor. This was a Christian, and I'm not saying this in any way to make fun of this person. I just think it's very instructive, and I think the way that the dialogue proceeded is helpful, because I think you will find skeptics doing this, and he was raising some questions about undesigned coincidences. And I think he was to some extent concerned about these supposed objections or these concerns that he was bringing up. I don't think he was just playing devil's advocate, but I think that for that very reason it deserves to be answered, because I think skeptics are very inclined, even non-Christians or Christians who for whatever reason want to debunk undesigned coincidences or debunk external confirmations. They are very inclined to sort of wave their hands and say, oh, well, that was common knowledge, that was common knowledge. So I want to use the actual example that he and I were talking about. And the example that we used for our discussion was the why ask Philip coincidence concerning John and Luke. So, as you know, we find that John mentions that Jesus said to Philip at the time of the feeding of the 5,000, "Where can we buy bread so that these may eat?" And he was testing them. He himself knew what he would do, John says. So he's sort of teasing them, where can we buy bread? And, Philip's horrified, the disciples are horrified. We don't have enough money to buy bread for these people. So, but why Philip? Why did he ask Philip? Well, elsewhere in John's gospel, apropos of other things, John mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida, which was also the home of Andrew and Peter. Okay, what does that have to do with the feeding of the 5,000? Well, in a completely different gospel, Luke mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 took place somewhere near Bethsaida. Okay, so the idea is that of the undesigned coincidence that this is actually true, that Jesus actually had this dialogue with Philip, and that the reason he was asking him, where can we buy bread, was because Philip was near there, and Jesus knew that. So that's why he picked one of the few people among his disciples who was from that region to make that sort of teasing, testing question, where can we buy bread? So my interlocutor suggested the following. He suggested that both the fact that Philip was from Bethsaida and the fact that, at least it was widely believed, it was part of the tradition, that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida, that these were just common knowledge. Therefore, even though he didn't spell it all out, but this is the direction that the objection was going, John could have been making up that dialogue with Philip without stressing in that passage where Philip was from, and without mentioning where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, because John was assuming that his readers or hearers would already believe those two things, and that would immediately, all he would have to do would be to mention Philip in the context of the feeding of the 5,000, and they would be right there thinking, yes, Philip, he's from Bethsaida, and the feeding of 5,000 supposedly took place near Bethsaida. I bet that's why, Jesus asked Philip. So in other words, John could have been even making that up, and making that subtle connection and hoping that his readers would make that subtle connection and see it as adding to the verisimilitude of his account because it was just commonly believed. Okay, and so he didn't need to mention it. So the casualness of the account then is supposedly not evidence of truth in that case. The casualness is explained by widespread common belief or common knowledge. Now, the first thing that I said to my interlocutor here, or that I really emphasized, and I want to emphasize here too, is that that's just a claim. That's just a blind postulate. Each statement, the statement that Philip was from Bethsaida, and the statement that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida, and the statement that Jesus was speaking to Philip, is found only in one gospel. So right away, why would you think of these as common knowledge? So it's just being sort of postulated out there. I bet it was common knowledge. You need more than that. You need more than a bare postulate. It would be very, very easy to confirm that an American adult audience in the year 2023 is going to be familiar with the flashing red lights in your rearview mirror. Most of us are drivers. Most of us have had driver's ed. Most of us have been warned about this, that you have to pull over right away if you see the flashers in your rearview mirror. And, therefore, it is common knowledge. All right, it's not just, maybe it was, or I bet it was, or something like that. There's massive evidence to that effect. So that was the first thing I emphasized, and I would emphasize that to you as well. Be prepared to just immediately push back and say, why do you think that was common knowledge? If someone claims that in an attempt to debunk something. So to pick another example, in John 7, John reports Jesus as saying that he who believes in me shall have rivers of living water springing up from his innermost being. And it's at the Feast of Tabernacles, and then we know from rabbinic sources that at the Feast of Tabernacles there was a water pouring ceremony where they actually got living water and it had to be living water. They brought that living water up and poured it over the altar, and this was a big deal. Actually, it was a big celebration, and I can easily imagine, if you bring this up as a confirmation that Jesus really said something like this, that a skeptic would say, well, John could be making that up. He could be assuming that that's common knowledge among his audience members. Now, I think Jesus assumed that the people who were right there at the feast knew it. But to say that John, because they're right there at that very feast, but to say that John was assuming that his readers would know it and that it would just be common knowledge, so he could just be making up what Jesus is saying, that again, there is no evidence for. And in fact, there's evidence against. We can find in John's gospel that he doesn't assume a Jewish audience. He will occasionally explain things as being for the purification ritual of the Jews, or that Rabboni means teacher, and so forth. John was well aware that he had a significant Gentile portion of his audience. There's also plenty of external evidence that his gospel was initially released in Asia Minor. So again, not in the Jerusalem area, even though John knows all kinds of things about Jerusalem. So no, okay, you can't just wave your hands and say, oh, that would have been common knowledge. So therefore, John could just be making it up and assuming his readers will go, oh, cool, connection to the water pouring ceremony, etc., etc. Second of all, just because something is known to somebody doesn't mean that it's known to everybody. I'm going to repeat that. Just because somebody knows something doesn't mean that everybody knows something. As our dialogue proceeded, my interlocutor suggested that evidence that this was common knowledge about the location of the feeding and the place where Philip was raised comes merely from the fact that Philip was well known to be an apostle, and that the people in the Christian community were talking a lot and telling these stories to one another. They were very interested. There was a lot of oral tradition. They were listening to the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and talking to one another and telling these things back and forth, and then that's it. Therefore, it's common knowledge. That doesn't follow. You can have a topic of interest to people, and that doesn't mean that there are no obscure facts about that topic and that everybody knows everything. The fact that you can look something up on Google and that it's out there on Google doesn't mean that everybody knows that fact. There is no one person who knows everything that's on Google except God, okay? And there was no Google at this time. But even more, since John says nothing about where Philip was from, and since John, in that immediate context, and since John says nothing anywhere about where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, why would anybody even have any reason to ask anybody about it, to try to connect it with his gospel, or to look it up, as it were? The fact that it's in Luke doesn't mean that it's common knowledge, just like the fact that something's out there on the internet doesn't mean that it's common knowledge. To illustrate, without Googling, without looking it up, where was John Piper born? I don't even know the answer to this. I didn't look it up. On purpose, I didn't look it up. John Piper's a very well-known person. Okay? But that doesn't mean that everybody knows where John Piper is from. Where was Tim McGrew born? Tim McGrew isn't as famous as John Piper, but there is an apologetics community. They're telling stories. They like to tell anecdotes. Do they all know where Tim McGrew was born? No, it doesn't follow. It doesn't follow from the fact that there are anecdotes about these people out there and that people like to talk about them, that this is known. Where did Tim McGrew first give the paper on Alvin Plantinga's Principle of Dwindling Probabilities that brought him and also me ultimately into the apologetic community? Do you know? No Googling, no looking it up. Okay, people talk a lot about, within this little niche community, about, Alvin Plantinga and Tim McGrew and arguments for the resurrection and for Christianity, and this brings all those things together, but that doesn't mean that everybody knows where Tim first gave that talk. So to just say they were talking a lot, they were telling a lot, and somebody knew it, does not mean that everybody knows it. And I really found eventually that my interlocutor was thinking of oral tradition as a thing, a single thing that contained all of the facts that anybody knew and was orally telling, as if it were a hive mind, so to speak. And I've seen this in response to undesigned coincidences elsewhere. Well, it was all the single source, which is oral tradition. If all you mean by oral tradition is everything that everybody told anybody else, then that's not a single source. Okay, it's a conglomerate, that's a composite composed of all these different things. You shouldn't think of it that way. Moreover, in this particular case, there is evidence to the contrary concerning the location of the feeding. Mark says that when Jesus sent away the disciples in a boat, he told them to row in a certain direction, and they were rowing toward Bethsaida. Skeptics will raise this as an alleged contradiction between Luke and Mark. Luke is saying they were already at Bethsaida or very near to Bethsaida. Mark is saying that when they rowed away, they rowed toward Bethsaida. Now, I think that this alleged discrepancy can be reasonably harmonized, but that's not the point. The very fact that there is an apparent discrepancy is evidence against the claim that everybody believed that the feeding of the 5,000 definitely took place somewhere very close to Bethsaida, and that it was just part of this, universally understood oral tradition that everybody was getting from telling each other stories. So I would encourage you, when you encounter this as a dismissive countermove to a subtle and casually mentioned piece of information that then fits up with something else, either in an undesigned coincidence or in an external confirmation that you push back. Don't just say, oh, wow, yeah, it's possible that was just common knowledge, so the person was just, assuming it in his made-up story. Don't just crumple when that's brought up. Ask yourself honestly, how plausible is that? What evidence is there for that? Who was the probable audience? And has this other person brought any evidence, or could this other person bring any evidence for that claim? When things appear to be obscure pieces of evidence, they often are obscure facts and would have been obscure to large numbers of the people in the original audience as well. And so when something that is told fits up with an obscure fact, a fact that would not have been known to everybody, or that we have no reason to believe would have been known to everybody, then that is evidence of truthfulness. So don't give up on casualness just because of the claim of common knowledge. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to teach you to do here at the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.